Gloria, Gloria, in excelsis Deo.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Doctrine, Dogma, and Davide podcast. My name is Davide, and today I want to talk about the four last things. These are things that don't necessarily get a lot of play, that people don't necessarily focus on a lot, and so I just wanted to sort of go over them, explain what the four last things are, and why they matter, and how they sort of apply to our faith. So, the four last things are death, judgment, heaven, and hell. And so the first of these is death. We all, I think, have a basic understanding of what death is. But death, fundamentally speaking, death is the separation of the soul from the body. That is sort of the theological definition of what death is. And it's worth noting that death is not natural to us. Death was never supposed to be a part of God's creation here, because we are corporeal beings and spiritual beings. We are body and soul, and our bodies and our souls were meant to remain intact. They were meant to remain together. It was only because of the fall that death became a part of the world. When Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit, ate the apple in the Garden of Eden, they introduced that discord and that rebellion into the creation. They distorted what God created, because we were never meant to die. And it's worth noting that because of this, because our bodies were meant to remain united with our souls, death is an inescapably sad and tragic thing. There is sometimes an attempt when a person passes away to try to spin it almost as a happy thing, because we know they're in heaven now. And that's not necessarily appropriate, I think. Because ultimately, yes, we hope for the resurrection of the dead, for the restoration of our bodies and our souls unified once again at the second coming. And we, of course, hope that all of the souls in heaven, while they await their glorified bodies, that everyone who dies does go to heaven and enjoys the beatific vision, awaiting the resurrection of the dead. But death is still a very sad and tragic thing. Take, for example, the shortest verse in the scriptures. Jesus wept. Jesus wept in response to hearing that his cousin John the Baptist had been killed. Jesus knew better than any of us ever will of the resurrection and the joys of heaven. And Jesus knew that St. John the Baptist would indeed be a saint and achieve the glories of heaven. And yet Jesus, with all of this knowledge, still wept. He cried over the death of his cousin, because death is a sad and ultimately unnatural thing. Now, the second of the last things is judgment. Now, there's a lot of scripture that talks about judgment, but I want to read briefly from Revelations, where it says, "And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Also another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged by what was written in the books, by what they had done. And the sea gave up the dead in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead in them, and all were judged by what they had done." Now, I really like the imagery here of the books being opened, because what I imagine is those books containing the deeds and the sins and the, indeed, righteous works performed by every person. And ultimately, I think that what judgment consists of is really just an evaluation of the state of a person's soul, according to their deeds and according to their faith. Just like what Revelation says, with the books being opened. I imagine that sort of like being, like your soul suddenly becoming an open book, and being visible in all of its iniquity, all of its faults, and all of its virtues as well. And according to the state of your soul, the question will be asked, have you made your soul fit for heaven, or have you made your soul fit for hell? Ultimately, your soul is cast wherever your soul is capable of residing. If your soul is capable of residing in the glories of heaven, if your soul is capable of perfect unity with God, if you are able to let go of all of the imperfections that you've accumulated in your life, and instead turn towards the perfection of God, then you will be judged righteous. If, however, you have prepared your soul by rejecting God, rejecting his gospel, and living a life of worldliness and sin, there's no reason to believe that your soul suddenly would, change its mind at the last second and choose God over the world, choose heaven over hell. And so, as a result, your soul, being unfit for heaven, is then fit only for hell, only for the rejection of God. And that brings me ultimately to the last two of the last things, heaven and hell. And I think it's important to understand what heaven and hell really are. Because we have this view of heaven being, a divine reward and hell being a divine punishment. And that's not inaccurate, but it's a little bit overly simplistic, I think. Because far more fundamentally, heaven and hell are natural consequences of simply the state of our souls. So what are heaven and hell? Ultimately, heaven and hell are very simple. Heaven is simply perfect union with God. Hell is total and complete separation from God. That's all heaven and hell are. The eternal bliss and eternal pain, torment, and suffering of heaven and hell, respectively, are simply a result of either the union or the separation. Because God is the source of all happiness, joy, hope, all pleasant things come from God. And so, when we have perfect union with him, it is indeed a perfect paradise. Likewise, the further we go from God, the more misery enters our lives, the more miserable we are. The further we get from perfect love, happiness, and joy, the more suffering and torment we experience. So, hell is its own punishment. Hell is the separation from God, and that separation from God is the punishment itself. Because ultimately, God does not force himself on anyone. If someone rejects God's offer of salvation, of perfect union with him, because they cannot let go of their sins, of the world, of the things that hold them back from being one with God, then God will not force them to give those things up, and will instead permit them to endure their misery. And it's sometimes hard to imagine, why would someone, with all of the knowledge in front of them, why would someone choose what they know will make them more miserable? Why would they still reject God, even at the final judgment? And a way I like to think about it is this. I'm sure most of us have known or at least heard stories of a person who is just, full of just bitterness and hatred towards another person or towards something. And I don't think that I've ever heard of someone or seen someone who was just so hateful and, angry all the time. I've never seen a person like that be happy. That type of bitterness and resentment that person is holding on to is making them miserable. And yet, they still cannot bring themselves to let go of it. They would still rather hold on to that hatred and that bitterness than to let it go, to forgive and be happy, even if they know that bitterness is making them miserable. I think that hell is very similar, where that your attachment to the worldly things, to sin, is making you miserable, but you can't bring yourself to let it go. And so just as that can happen on earth, I think that the same thing, in a way, happens to those souls who are cast into hell. And I think that it is far easier than we sometimes think to allow those worldly things, those sins, to choke out the divine life in our hearts and in our souls. So then, if that's hell, then what's heaven? I said before, heaven is perfect union with God. Well, because God is perfect, the only people that can have a truly perfect union with God are those who are perfect. It's like Jesus said, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Does that mean that you have to be completely perfect, having never committed a single sin in your life, in order to go to heaven? No, that's not the case. But you have to be perfectible. That again is sort of the distinction between the damned and the saved, because the saved keep their hearts open to being perfected, whereas the damned are closed to the final purification of God. Now that said, sinners who ultimately are saved, who ultimately have made themselves perfectible by God, they still have sins on their soul. They still have crimes for which they need to atone. They have a purification that is necessary. And so that's where they go through purgatory. Purgatory is not like a second chance where, people who otherwise would be damned have a second chance at trying to be saved. No. Purgatory is for the saved. And so what purgatory is it is a place of suffering, of penance, where you pay the price, the penalty, for the sins you have committed in your life, so that you can then be perfected and go on to perfect union in heaven. And I think that, again, the analogy of the open books described in Revelation is, I think, very fitting, because when, again, your soul becomes an open book, you will see your soul in all of its iniquity. You will see the damage. With stunning clarity, you will see the damage that sin has inflicted upon you and upon your soul. And you will see your iniquity in all its fullness. And so the souls who ultimately accept God's offer of salvation will willingly enter themselves into purgatory to have their souls purified so that they can be fittingly unified with God. I've heard it said that the souls in purgatory, even though they are suffering, are happier than any souls on earth. And it's good for us to pray for the souls in purgatory, because it helps for those souls to be delivered, to let go of any final attachments or lingering dedications to sins, or any lingering imperfections that are holding them back from that perfect union with God. And so, even though those souls are suffering, they're still joyous. They have joy in their suffering. Much in the way that someone might suffer the pains of a workout in order to improve their health and their strength, so too do the souls in purgatory endure the suffering and the pains of purgatory, of that penance, so that they can achieve the greater glories of heaven. So those are the four last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell. And I've given you just a brief explanation of how I go about thinking of those things and how I go about explaining them. I hope it was helpful for you. If it was, leave a like, comment, do whatever it is people of the internet do, and hopefully I will see you all later.